All right, we're going to get rolling here. All right, everybody, welcome to another edition of Art Brunch. Want to start off with a couple of announcements. First of all, we had an opening last night for Adderley Grant Lord's exhibit here at the Off-Broadway Gallery. It was a wonderful event, and she is actually going to be speaking about the themes associated with the Black Futures in Art exhibit, which is actually at several venues in Boulder. She'll be doing that here at the Off-Broadway Gallery on Thursday the 12th, 5 to 8 p.m. So if you are in the Front Range area of Colorado, please put that on your calendar. I'd love to see you. Also, another public event. This is going to be our own Michael Sharon, aka Patrick Jolly. He has a special exhibit at the First Congregational Church nearby here in Boulder, Colorado. It's called Arcana and the Sacred. All metaphysical type works, no real landscapes, just a few for biographical purposes. But anyway, he has two events associated with it as well. One is February 26th, that's the opening reception. And the other is March 8th, that's a Sunday at noon. And he'll be having a conversation with me. I'll do a brief, like 10 to 15 minute opening presentation on the 8th, and then I'll invite him up and we'll have a very interesting conversation. Food will be provided for that March 8th event. So also, if you're in the Front Range area, put those dates down as well. All right, we are continuing with our new series, Our Shared Traditions, question mark here, and this is part 2. Now, I want to speak with you today about a paradox that lives at the heart of our human experience. A paradox that is denied in our divisive environment today, something I've been emphasizing recently, the paradox of unity through diversity, of agreement without conformity. In an age where we're told that pluralism inevitably leads to fragmentation, where difference seems destined to divide us, I want to explore how certain luminous figures from our past have actually served as gravitational centers for wildly diverse communities, Republican, Democrat, that sort of thing, not by demanding that everyone think alike, but by awakening something deeper, a shared longing, a common aspiration toward transcendence, truth, goodness, and beauty. These saints and heroes, and I use those words broadly, including both the canonized and the secular martyrs of conscience, they didn't create unity by flattening out our differences. They created it by standing so fully in their particular truth that they became reflections of something universal. Now, on my art pilgrimages, I like our pilgrims to visit sacred places like cathedrals, which are full of artistic beauty. Whether a pilgrim is particularly religious or not, they can look at the stained glass of a translucent saint or hero when they enter these spaces. Each pane is a distinct color, expressing a unique story, yet all transforming ordinary light into something sacred, something that illuminates a space where strangers become pilgrims together. Now, in such spaces, we find many murals. Murals depicting saints and heroes of all of us can find inspiring. Consider Saint Francis of Assisi, that radical troubadour of the 13th century who appears to us across 8 centuries as both utterly medieval, but also startlingly contemporary. Giotto's frescoes in the Basilica of St. Francis that you see here tell his story in 28 scenes. Francis's compassion for the poor, his renouncing of materialism, and of course, his preaching to the birds. But what makes Francis perpetually relevant to so many people isn't his specific theological positions or even his institutional reforms. It's his orientation toward radical compassion, toward creation itself as a family of siblings, toward poverty as freedom rather than deprivation, qualities that attract the attention of a wide variety of people. The brilliance of Francis as a unifying figure is that Muslims, Buddhists, contemporary environmentalists, and traditional Catholics can all find something to venerate in him without having to agree on doctrine. As many of you have done, I'm sure, I have seen St. Francis statues in the gardens of both Democrats and Republicans. He is a unifying figure. And when he crossed enemy lines during the Fifth Crusade to meet Sultan al-Kamil, he modeled something revolutionary. The possibility that genuine encounter across difference, culturally, religiously, might be more sacred than armed conquest for truth. The remarkable painting by Benozzo Gozzoli, St. Francis and the Sultan, captures this moment not as conversion or capitulation, but as mutual recognition. Francis unified not by converting everyone to his particular creed, but by embodying a creed of love so particular it became universal. Well, now pivot with me to a very different figure, Giordano Bruno, the Dominican friar who became a martyr not to faith, but to an even more expansive vision of cosmic truth and personal liberty. When you stand before the statue of Bruno in Rome's Campo de' Fiori, erected on the very spot where he was burned at the stake in 1600 on my birthday, as a matter of fact, you're in the presence of a different kind of saint. One claimed by free thinkers, scientists, mystics, and all rebels against dogmatic authority. You see, Bruno proposed an infinite universe filled with infinite worlds, a vision that shattered the cozy cosmology of his era, and it threatened both religious and philosophical establishments. The extraordinary thing about Bruno is how he functions as a unifying symbol precisely for those who refuse singular narratives. Atheists and pantheists, astronomers and cultists, all find in Bruno a patron saint of their own questioning. His martyrdom wasn't for a system of belief, but for the right to think freely, even dangerously, to place no shackles on the imagination. In this sense, Bruno unifies not by what he believed, but by what he refused, the narrowing of human imagination to fit comfortable orthodoxies. Well, let's shift now to Joan of Arc, the illiterate peasant girl who heard voices, led armies, crowned a king, and died at the young age of 19 in flames. Jules Bastien Lepage's 1879 painting Joan of Arc shows us a young woman in her parents' garden, frozen at the moment of her calling. Saints materializing behind her. Do you see them in golden light? What makes Joan perpetually compelling across wildly different constituencies, whether they be feminists or nationalists, mystics or military historians, Catholics or secular Republicans, is her impossible combination of humility and audacity, of her courageous leadership in battle as a teenager, and her defiance of every earthly authority that tried to silence her. Joan unifies by embodying a kind of courage that transcends the specific content of her mission. Whether you believe her voices came from heaven or from her own unconscious genius, whether you see her primarily as a military tactician or a mystic visionary, Joan represents the possibility that an ordinary person, like one of us, particularly one denied power by every convention of their society, can alter history by sheer force of conviction. Mark Twain, of all people, that skeptical American humorist, considered his book on Joan of Arc his finest work, approaching her with a reverence he gave no other subject. She gathers disparate admirers because she demonstrates that individual conscience, even in a young woman with no credentials, can speak truth that institutions and armies must eventually acknowledge. Mary Magdalene again offers us yet another pattern of unifying power through complexity as well as contradiction. In Renaissance and Baroque art, from Artemisia Gentileschi's Penitent Magdalene with its combination of extraordinary strength combined with sensuousness, to Donatello's gaunt wooden sculpture of her as an aged hermit. In her, we see a figure who has been everything and nothing, prostitute and apostle, sinner, and yet the apostle to the apostles, depending on who's telling the story and when they're telling it. The recent reclamation of Mary Magdalene by feminist theologians, her elevation in contemporary spiritual communities that see in her a suppressed feminine voice in Christianity, this runs parallel to her traditional role as a model penitent in Catholic devotion. Both can be held together. Mary Magdalene unifies not despite but through these seeming contradictions. She's a screen onto which different communities project their deepest questions. Questions about sexuality and sanctity, embodiment and transcendence, masculine authority and feminine wisdom. The fact that we're still arguing about who she really was, still producing novels about her, films, scholarly monographs, trying to recover her quote unquote true story, means she remains vitally alive, a figure around whom dialogue continues. Caravaggio's Martha and Mary Magdalene shows the sisters together, but in rather, I'd say, heated conversation, a disagreement at least, and that exchange across differences among family is itself the unifying work. And again, this image of Benjamin Franklin that I showed last week. In the context this morning, Franklin is a hero all of us, regardless of our political persuasion or economic philosophy even, I believe, all of us can admire. He is the civic-minded polymath, using his gifts to contribute to his city, his country, to the global community by excelling in business, science, philosophy, diplomacy, and writing. His legacy of celebrating the messiness of democracy, the absolute necessity of compromise in a successful republic, is much needed. It's a much needed and healthy direct rebuke of our childish political tribalism. Now, this mural by Constantino Brumidi in the US Capitol building, it mythologizes the first US president, presents him as the embodiment of restraint itself. See, Washington is seen ascending not through conquest, but through his refusal, refusal of kingship, refusal of presidential permanence. In legacy terms, this is rare. This is a powerful testament against some of our current political figures, not simply in the US, but in the world. I wish those who favor authoritarianism and dictatorship would take a long, long look at the symbol, the meaning of George Washington. And when we come to Mahatma Gandhi, we encounter a figure who explicitly taught and lived the work of unity in diversity. Gandhi's philosophy focused on the welfare of all, and his practice of bringing together Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, and others in the Indian independence movement, it was never about erasing difference. It was about finding that place of shared aspiration beneath different traditions. Now, some of you have seen Attenborough's film Gandhi. Ben Kingsley's portrayal in that movie captures those moments where he sits in prayer meetings or reading from the Bhagavad Gita, where he then follows with passages from the Quran and then the Bible and the Buddha Sutras. He does this not to create a blind synthesis, but honor each tradition's particular voice while revealing an underlying harmony. What made Gandhi a gravitational center wasn't that everyone agreed with his tactics or his theology. Secular Indians found him too religious. Orthodox Hindus found him too radical. You see, he rejected the caste system and the philosophy of untouchability. Muslim leaders ultimately chose partition over Gandhi's pluralistic vision, and yet Gandhi still unified vast numbers of people toward independence, precisely because he grounded political action in spiritual practice, whether he was fasting, whether he was praying, or whether he was doing his ritual use of a spinning wheel. Some of you may be familiar with that. Margaret Bourke-White's iconic photographs of Gandhi at his spinning wheel show us a revolutionary whose weapon was the most humble domestic tool, whose power came from voluntary powerlessness. You see, for Mahatma Gandhi, the spinning wheel was the central symbol of India's independence, economic self-reliance, and nonviolent resistance against British rule. It represented a rejection of foreign-made goods, promoted dignity of labor, and served as a unifying daily action-oriented tool for the nationalist movement. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. performed a similar kind of unifying work in a different context. When you look at the photographs from the March on Washington, that sea of faces, black and white, young and old, clergy and vestments standing next to secular activists, you see the fruit of King's peculiar genius for creating a movement capacious enough to include pacifist Quakers and former soldiers, include Christian ministers and Jewish rabbis, include Northern liberals moved by guilt and Southern activists driven by lived experiences of oppression. What King provided was not a detailed blueprint everyone had to accept, but simply a direction of travel toward that beloved community that he talks so much about, toward the arc of the moral universe bending toward justice. The metaphorical language drawn from his rich synthesis of Black Baptist Christianity, as well as Gandhi's teachings and personalist philosophy and American democratic ideals, it created space for diverse peoples to march together. Harriet Tubman gives us yet another model of unifying agency. This extraordinary 1945 painting by William H. Johnson showing Tubman as if she were dressed in the flag, rifle in hand, it captures her dual nature. She is an armed liberator and a Moses figure. She is a pragmatic strategist as well as a visionary prophet. Now, that woman at the lower right, that's Tubman as an elderly woman, her head draped in the shawl given to her by England's Queen Victoria. Harriet Tubman's reported visions and her seizures, her deep religious faith existing alongside her willingness to threaten violence against any escaped slave who wanted to turn back and endanger the group, all this makes her a very complex figure who resists simplification. Tubman unifies across time and across different communities because she represents a kind of freedom that's both spiritual and brutally physical. She didn't wait for everyone to agree on the morality of slavery or the tactics of resistance. She acted, and in acting, she created a path that others could follow, each bringing their own reasons for the journey. Let me bring in some additional figures across time and place to deepen this tapestry. Consider the Buddha, particularly as he appears in the Gandhara sculptures where Greek artistic influence meets Indian spiritual vision, creating images of serene awakening that don't belong to any single culture. The Buddha's teaching of the middle way, of finding liberation between extremes, has allowed Buddhist practice to adapt to radically different societies: Japanese, Tibetan, Thai, and now Western, without losing its essential character. The Buddha unifies not by insisting everyone become culturally Buddhist, but by pointing toward a possibility of awakening that each culture can approach through its own door. Or consider Rumi, the 13th century Persian poet, whose whirling meditation and ecstatic verses have made him improbably the best-selling poet in America. Modern translations have allowed Rumi to speak to secular spiritual seekers who might never enter a mosque or a church for that matter, while traditional Sufis continue their practices rooted in Islamic mysticism. Rumi unifies by the sheer beauty and intensity of his longing for union with the divine, a longing that transcends the specific theological container, even while being inseparable from it. Well, now, what are we to make of these figures? Francis and Bruno, Joan of Arc and Mary Magdalene, Gandhi, MLK Jr., Harriet Tubman, the Buddha, and Rumi. They're so different from each other. Some were religious in conventional senses, others heretical. Still others operating in traditions we barely have categories for. Some were celibate ascetics, others married householders. Some preached nonviolence, others took up arms. Some worked within institutions, others were destroyed by them. And yet there are common threads. First, each of these figures lived with such integrity, such radical alignment between their inner vision and outer action, that they became transparent to something larger than themselves. When we venerate St. Francis, we're not primarily interested in Francis as a personality. We're drawn to what Francis points toward: an ever-expanding circle of compassion. The same with Gandhi's willingness to fast unto death, with King's willingness to go to jail, with Tubman's willingness to return again and again into slave territory when she could have remained safely north. Their lives become artworks, carefully crafted practices of turning their very existence into a living testimony. Second, these figures didn't primarily ask people to agree with propositions, but to orient themselves toward values, compassion, truth, justice, freedom, wisdom, beauty. Aspiration is more spacious than mere agreement. I can aspire towards the same horizon you do while walking a different path, bringing different gifts, even understanding the destination differently. When people gathered around King, they were unifying around a direction of travel toward justice, toward freedom. Even when they disagreed profoundly about theology, about tactics, about ultimate political structures. Third, these unifying figures are often most powerful at their points of greatest vulnerability, contradiction, or failure. Joan of Arc and Giordano Bruno were set aflame, literally. Gandhi assassinated, King assassinated. These aren't stories of triumphant heroes imposing their will, but of vulnerable humans maintaining their integrity even unto death. Their very fragility, their capacity to suffer and fail, makes them accessible to us in our fragility and our own failure. Again, Mary Magdalene. Let's go back to her. Her power comes partly from her ambiguity, her contested identity, the ways she's been misunderstood and misrepresented. That makes her available to all of us who have been misunderstood, misrepresented, whose identities are contested. The cracks in these figures, the ways they don't fit into neat categories, are precisely where the light gets in. Those cracks create space for diverse peoples to enter, to find their own reflection, their own aspiration, regardless of their political or religious affiliations. Well, what does this mean for us, for our contemporary crisis of pluralism? We live in a moment of intense fragmentation, political, religious, cultural. The internet was supposed to connect us, but its algorithms often sort us into increasingly hostile tribes. We're told that diversity inevitably leads to conflict, and so we must choose our tribe rather than find common cause. The key for us in such a culture, in such an atmosphere, under such pressures, the key is finding figures, causes, practices that are thick enough, complex enough, beautiful enough to draw all of us who are diverse, toward them, while allowing multiple approaches, multiple interpretations, multiple paths of participation. This isn't relativism. This isn't saying all paths are the same. Francis was specifically Christian, Gandhi specifically Hindu, the Buddha specifically teaching a path out of suffering through the Noble Eightfold Way. Their particularity mattered, but their particularity was so deep, so fully embodied that it cracked open into something more universal. It was like a well that's dug so deep it hits the water table that underlies separate properties. Their particular digging accessed a wellspring that all of us can share in. For spiritual seekers and art lovers, this suggests a practice. We can approach these figures, these traditions, through beauty and aspiration rather than through doctrinal agreement or historical argument. We can let the art teach us how to see, how to recognize the sacred in unfamiliar forms. When we stand before different representations of the sacred, whether it's an Orthodox icon or a Tibetan thangka, we're practicing a kind of visual pluralism, training our eyes and hearts to recognize truth in diverse forms. We can also ask, what are we doing with our lives that might serve this unifying function for others? We may not be destined to become saints or heroes ourselves, or at least in the historical sense, but we can ask whether we're living with enough integrity, enough alignment between our inner values and our outer actions, that we become transparent to something larger. We can ask whether we're creating aspiration fields or just defending belief systems. We can ask whether we're leaving space for others to approach the same truth, but from different angles, or whether we're insisting everyone walk our exact path. The diversity of these figures also reminds us that there's no single template for this work. St. Francis unified through gentleness, Joan of Arc through holy audacity, Giordano Bruno through martyrdom for intellectual freedom, Harriet Tubman through armed liberation. The shape of our particular calling, our particular gift, it will be unique, but the pattern still holds. Live our truth so fully, so courageously, so beautifully that it becomes a light by which others can navigate their own journey. Well, as we close, I want you to imagine a gallery of the Spirit. And in it hang all of these figures we've discussed and thousands more, each in their own frame, their own light, in their own particular genius. Yet the gallery itself creates a larger composition, a conversation across centuries and continents about what it means to be fully human, fully alive, fully oriented toward truth, goodness, and beauty. This is how pluralism becomes not a problem to solve, but a richness to celebrate. Not a cacophony, but a symphony. They teach us that unity is possible precisely through our differences, when those differences are deep enough to reach the common water, when they're beautiful enough to draw us all into wonder, when they're true enough to orient us towards shared aspiration for a world more compassionate, more just, more awake, more free.